I'm told I can start. So welcome to all of you. It's 11 a.m. in the United States, in Notre Dame at least, and it is 5 o'clock p.m. over here in Rome. And mind you, you are muted so that you cannot speak at this particular time when the conversation would be over. That is to say, when Michael and John would have done their whatever they have to say, then we will admit onlookers onto as unmuted, and you could actually intervene and ask your question or your commentaries. So you're muted now, and this particular event is being recorded, which means that if you want to take a look at it later on or tell your friends and colleagues, then it's available. It will be available in the Notre Dame YouTube site, or whatever you call it. So my name is Luca Codignola. I'm here as Senior Fellow of the Cushwa Center for the Study of American Catholicism. And this event is being organized by the Cushwa Center in collaboration with the Rome Global Gateway in Rome. And I do represent, in this particular case, Professor Kathleen Sprouse-Cummings, who is the director of the Cushwa Center. And on the top of that, she has different titles, but I like to point out to her as director of the Cushwa Center, who unfortunately cannot be here today. We knew that she would have been absent, so she sends her regards and apologies. And I also speak on behalf of Dr. Silvia Dall'Olio, who is the director of the Rome Global Gateway. And I wish to thank on this particular occasion Costanza Montanari, Anna Riciliano, and Danilo Domenici for making this Zoom event possible. We do have a really international and transnational audiences. We do have colleagues from Notre Dame, from Hamilton College, the Catholic University of America in the US, St. Edward's, Diocese of Portland. And then from Canada, we have a fellow and a friend from Prince Edward Island. And then several universities in Italy, including Roma Tre, one of the several Rome University, Roma Tre, the Pontifical University of Santa Croce, University of Tuscia in Viterbo, University of Chieti Pescara, the Università Gregoriana, who properly is not Rome, but it's Vatican, but we consider it as part of Rome, and University of Salerno. And let me start by introducing, first of all, our main guest speaker, with the person we will be speaking about, is Dr. Michael Breidenbach, who is associate professor and chair of history at Ave Maria University in Florida, and also senior affiliate for legal humanities and the program for research on religion and urban civil society at the University of Pennsylvania. He studied at Northwestern University, at King's College in Oxford, and was also visiting student at the Sorbonne in Paris some years ago. And then he held a research position and taught also in different places. He is really a transnational person. He taught and did research in Oxford, Cambridge in the UK, Princeton, Villanova, and the University of Pennsylvania in the US. And his research interests concern the history of political, legal, and religious thought, especially in early America and the Atlantic world. His particular interest is religious liberty, church and state, and the relationship between religion and politics. And he's a proficient contributor to scholarly journals, but also to less scholarly journals like The Atlantic, Washington Post, First Thing, and has recently published in scholarly journal like the William and Mary Quarterly. Last year, 2020, he managed to co-edit a book called The Cambridge Companion to the First Amendment and Religious Liberty, Cambridge University Press. And this year, and this is why we are here today, he published Our Dear Bought Liberty, Catholics and Religious Toleration in Early America, published by Harvard University Press, 2021. This is the book. Doesn't have the flap cover, but major book, and I'm very glad we can speak about it today. The book is about, to summarize, a history of religious liberty and church-state relations in early America and the Atlantic world. Now, let me just introduce you very briefly also our second speaker, who will be the commentator on Michael Breidenbach's book. John Mcgreevey, you can see on your screen, white shirt, is the Francis McAnany Professor of History at University of Notre Dame. He was chair of the Department of History for some 10 years, 2002, 2009, and he was also Dean of the College of Arts and Letters, 2008, 2018. And among other honors, he served on the Pulitzer Prize jury for history in 2010. And since 2018, he was also co-chair of the Commonwealth Foundation Board. He also has contributed to a number of scholarly journals with essays and articles, Journal of American History, New York Review of Books, Chronicle of Higher Education, Commonwealth, the New Republic, Chicago Tribune, etc. And he's the author, let me point out, the author of three important books. One is titled Parish Boundaries, the Catholic Encounter with Race in the 20th Century Urban North, published by University of Chicago Press, 2000, I don't have the dates here. Maybe John can tell me. I've forgotten to put down the date. But then second book was Catholicism and American Freedom, a History, published by Norton, 2003. The first one was published by University of Chicago Press. And then a recent book 2 years ago, and actually 3 or 4 years ago, 2016, was American Jesuits and the Word, How an Embattled Religious Order Made Modern Catholicism Global, Princeton University Press, 2016. He's also working at another book, which tentatively it's entitled Catholicism, A Global History from the French Revolution to Pope Francis. And let me stop here, but because I like to let the speaker speak. And first of all, John Mcgreevey. One last note, both John and Michael were guests here at the Rome Global Gateway in the past. They were contributors, participants in conferences, and personally, I was very happy and honored to be invited at their own home bases in Ave Maria and Notre Dame. So it's a real opportunity for me, and I'm very happy to meet them again, although virtually in these times of Zoom meetings here today. And let's start with John Mcgreevey first. He will speak for about 20 minutes, roughly. Then Michael will have an opportunity to respond, and then it will be time for us to give questions. John, up to you.
Thank you. So you are teaching American political thought. You begin briefly with John Locke and his two treatises written in the 1670s. You jump to the American Revolution and the Constitution and note the importance of Locke for the American founders in the 1770s. A student asks you, John Locke says, no government can allow Catholics as citizens, since they have an irrevocable allegiance to a pope willing to interfere in temporal affairs. They can't be trusted. And if John Locke says this, and if John Locke was so important for the American founders, why did Catholics such as Charles and John Carroll so vigorously support the US Revolution, and even in Charles Carroll's case, help draft the Constitution? You pause. You mumble something about the alliance during the Revolutionary War with the French. You hope for the bell to ring. And now you reach for your copy of Michael Breidenbach's Our Dear Bought Liberty. It's a true story, and of course, it's one reason I'm happy to be here today. I want to thank my colleague, Kathy Cummings, for her invitation, of course, for her continued work as director of the Cushwa Center for the Study of American Catholicism. I'd also like to thank my friend and colleague Luca Codignola, who along with Matteo Sanfilippo has for several years had the James Bond sounding title of Cushwa agent in Rome, and who honestly doesn't think of Daniel Craig when meeting Luca Codignola. Over the years, Luca's scholarly example, often on topics of direct concern for today's discussion, and his generosity have permitted Americans like myself to become part of an international scholarly community. It's a rare privilege for which I remain grateful. I'll note at the outset that I consider Michael Breidenbach's Our Dear Bought Liberty unequivocally excellent. It makes a contribution in the realm of political theory to the world sketched by Harvard's Eric Nelson and Notre Dame's own Brad Gregory, arguing for a less sharp demarcation between medieval and modern, and a strong sense that religion produced a form of toleration, not only internecine conflict. It is one of the most important recent books in modern Catholic history, a now flourishing subfield where the bar in the last decade has become wonderfully high. It is clearly argued, brilliantly researched, and important in its implications. It even has a welcome, although to my mind, not entirely persuasive, contemporary edge. If Breidenbach had consulted me when he was beginning his doctoral work, I would have solemnly cautioned him against trying to say anything new on John Carroll or Maryland or religious liberty. About religious liberty, there's an ocean of scholarship, much of it repetitive and polemical. There's an extensive, admittedly often hagiographic, literature on the English Jesuits arriving on the Ark and Dove at Chesapeake Bay in 1634, a tradition, admittedly, that includes fine work by scholars such as Tricia Pine. There is more recent excellent work on Maryland and John Carroll by, among others, Catherine O'Donnell and Maura Farrelly. But my advice would have been wrong. We needed, as it turns out, our dear bought liberty. For the rest of my 15 minutes, I'll try to sketch Breidenbach's achievement and also ask 4 questions to spur our common conversation. One dimension of Breidenbach's achievement is to place the Maryland colony founders, George Calvert and Cecil Calvert, into English history. I found the sections of the book on the Calverts, which is really the first third of the book, revelatory, as they navigate the fraught world of England in the 17th century, with a monarch beheaded, another monarch exiled, the House of Lords abolished briefly, a Republican government installed briefly, and then in 1714, a monarch again imported. George Calvert commissions paintings from the great artist of the Catholic Baroque, Peter Paul Rubens, but he also gets married in an Anglican ceremony to keep up appearances in the tricky, fraught world of 17th century England, where Catholics were sort of tolerated, but often not. The Calverts even felt direct repercussions, a young George Calvert, from the 1604 Guy Fawkes plot. The Calverts' Catholicism, always conciliar in style, but also royalist in an increasingly Republican age, made them suspect, and this uneasiness in England prompted their interest in colonial projects. The last generation of historians of Puritanism, maybe above all David Hall, have recast Puritanism as part of 17th century English and Scottish and Dutch history, instead of the dawn of the American experiment. Breidenbach places the Calverts and their experiment in Maryland in an equally revealing transatlantic and English context. Just as a famous Puritan like Increase Mather fled for New England after the ousting of Oliver Cromwell in 1660, Cecil Calvert focused on Maryland when suspicions of Catholicism in England made his life uncomfortable or even dangerous. This welcome focus on the Calverts and the origins of the Maryland colony in effectively its English origins prompts my first question. Did Breidenbach ever think about writing a book on the Calverts alone, or was he always focused on the precise question of religious liberty? The hinge point between the Calverts and then the Carrolls from the late 17th century to the mid 18th century. So the Calverts take up the first third of the book, roughly, the Carrolls, maybe the second 2/3. That hinge point is the one spot in the book where I saw a sort of logical and chronological gap. You could have imagined two books, one on the Calverts, one on the Carrolls, or am I missing something important? So that's my first question. A second dimension of Breidenbach's achievement is to integrate the experience of Catholics in colonial Maryland, but also colonial Canada, into the history of Western political thought. This sounds pompous. Western political thought? Really? But it's true. Beginning with luminaries such as Quentin Skinner, modern scholars in the last 40 years have traced the existence of conciliarism, which I should roughly define as an anti-papal strain of Catholic thought, beginning in the medieval period. The conciliar focus on representation within the church, again, anti-papal, thinking about the role of bishops in particular, but also even important lay Catholics in the governance of the church. Its focus on representation within the church melded into ideas about representation within the polity. And for Skinner and his scholarly descendants, of whom there are many, it helps explain the origins of small r republicanism. Skinner is arguably the most important post-war figure in the history of political theory, but he had distressingly little interest in religion. Dale Van Clay and others, including my colleague Ulrich Lehner, do have such an interest in religion, and Van Clay in particular has, with a bloodhound's tenacity, tracked Reform or Conciliar Catholics across Europe and beyond. Van Clay's long-standing claim that this conciliar or Reformed Catholicism played a powerful role in causing the French Revolution now seems confirmed within that literature, and indeed in much writing on politics in late 18th century Europe, the importance of conciliar Catholicism or Reformed Catholicism in Van Clay's term. A distinguished medievalist, often cited by Breidenbach, like Francis Oakley, also, by the way, a serious Catholic, devoted the latter part of his career to sketching the conciliar strain of Catholic thought and its ultimate demise at the hands of unscrupulous ultramontanists, with the final deathbed agonies for conciliarism occurring at the First Vatican Council. Breidenbach places Charles Carroll and Bishop John Carroll, their second cousins. Charles Carroll is Maryland's largest planter, and Bishop John Carroll is, of course, the first bishop in the United States, appointed in 1789. Breidenbach places Charles Carroll and Bishop John Carroll into this international conciliar ultramontane discussion. Both the Carrolls insisted on their identity as Catholics, but they both also resisted, for reasons both principled and prudential, any hint of papal interference in public affairs. They could comfortably support the Republican Revolution in the North American British colonies, meaning the United States, in part because they favored republicanism, at least of a sort, within Catholicism, not just in the political realm, but within the church. Carroll, in his younger days, was interested in the vernacular liturgy because of his republicanism, just as he welcomed the election of bishops by parish priests for the same reason. So that gets me to my second question. Perhaps it's related to the first. All historians face decisions. One is whether to go long or to go wide. Breidenbach has gone long. The book begins really in the 16th century and goes all with the Calverts, and then goes all the way up to John Courtney Murray and debates over church and state in the 1950s. Long span, 16th century to 1950s. What would it look like to go wide? Do, for example, the Carrolls and their conciliar Catholicism resemble the small r Republican Catholics assembled at the Cortes of Cadiz in Spain in 1812, which results in the first constitution in the Spanish Empire and a kind of democratic assembly in Spain? Do they resemble Henri Grégoire during the French Revolution, strong advocate for the French Revolution and strong advocate for democracy? Do they resemble Fray Mier, the priest who's one of the key drafters of the Mexican Constitution in the 1820s? All are small r Republican Catholics, all are associated with conciliarism, and there's direct links among all of these people. Do they connect to the Carrolls? Or how would we think about them as a group? I realize the Carols are working in a Protestant empire and then a Protestant nation, the United States. But still, to take Van Clay and others seriously, it seems to me, is to say that this conciliar and often small r Republican Catholicism had many provincial variations, of which the Carols were just one. Do I have that right? Or is there something distinctive, I tremble as I say the word exceptional, about the US context? As a side note, let's call it question 2A. Breidenbach's conciliar Catholics, such as the Carols, did not denounce slavery, and both Carols owned enslaved people. Upon his death, Charles Carroll owned 300 enslaved people, and in his will, he freed exactly one. Breidenbach includes a haunting folk song inspired by Nat Turner's 1831 rebellion, referencing the Carols as one of the slave owners at whom Nat Turner directed his brutally suppressed revolt. But in my understanding, most conciliar Catholics, anti-papal, anti-ultramontane, were far more likely than their ultramontane foes to oppose slavery. Gregoire and Mier, for example, Mier in Mexico, Gregoire in France, were abolitionists. Ultramontanists trained in Rome were typically not. Do I have that right? How does the slavery question shape our understanding of the Carols? So I'm calling that question 2A. We're now at Breidenbach's most important achievement. Breidenbach convincingly lays out how the Reformed Catholic or conciliar Catholic tradition, that is, deeply Catholic but resolutely opposed to any papal interference in temporal politics, shaped the American idea of religious liberty as articulated and drafted in the US Constitution. That the Constitution prohibits religious tests for office holders when such tests bedeviled Catholics in England, that the First Amendment to the Constitution bans a religious establishment, all of this depends, at least in some small part, on Charles Carroll's conciliar Catholicism and his experience of religious liberty in North America. The direct evidence for Charles Carroll's influence on the Constitution is unfortunately only circumstantial, not because of anything Breidenbach has missed, he's seen everything, but because of how little we know of the drafting process of the Constitution. Nonetheless, we add to John Locke and republicanism and all the other vocabularies that inform the drafters of the Constitution, conciliar Catholicism. I'm persuaded. What's remarkable is that US Catholics, including US presidents, also understood this. I should say, what's remarkable is not only US Catholics, but also US presidents understood this. James Madison, at least obliquely, knew that this conciliar strain allowed for a different kind of Catholicism, one that could be easily absorbed within the Republican experiment. Andrew Jackson declared a national day of mourning, I didn't know this, upon Bishop John Carroll's death. I do not expect President Biden to do the same when, say, Archbishop Chaput goes to his reward. Years ago, doing research for my second book, I remember being astonished by how sophisticated some anti-Catholics, such as Maryland Senator Henry Davis or various figures in Louisiana, were. They wanted a John Carroll type Catholicism, and by the 1840s and 1850s could only and accurately see around them the ascendancy of a global ultramontanism. They were more anti-papal than anti-Catholic before papal and Catholic became close to synonymous. The same, by the way, is true, as Breidenbach demonstrates, of the parish trustees battling ultramontane bishops in the early 19th century, because these trustees too were aware of a different form of Catholicism, a conciliar Catholicism, and to read their manifestos and pamphlets carefully, as Breidenbach does, is to see their awareness. When John Carroll dies, as Breidenbach tells us, he is celebrated in the United States, but attacked in ultramontane Rome, because so long ago he had supported a revolution against an empire, which by the 1830s or 1840s was verboten within the ultramontane worldview of Rome. So my third question is this. It's very just curiosity. How have historians of early America, thus far at least, received Breidenbach's claim of conciliarism being one of the languages of American republicanism and the languages of American constitution making? Finally, on the contemporary moment, I confess I found Breidenbach oblique on this point. My own reading is that John Courtney Murray and others, as Breidenbach demonstrates, recovered something of a more conciliar Catholicism from the original medieval sources, such as John of Paris, medieval figure. But by that point, the ultramontane revolution in the 19th century had made the 18th century version of Catholicism held by the Carols psychologically and intellectually inaccessible. That is, Murray in the 1950s can only try and pull sources back from the medieval period that offer a slightly more conciliar vision of religious liberty. He really doesn't even have available to him the 18th century dynamic because it's been so concealed by the overwhelming triumph of ultramontanism. Anyway, that's what I'm speculating. Murray's sources and instincts, beyond pulling from some medieval texts, were in fact more contemporary. And only now, in the wake of the Second Vatican Council, can Breidenbach and many others, I was at a talk by Sean Blanchard on Jansenism, which is part of, I think, this general frame just recently here at Notre Dame. Only now, in the wake of the Second Vatican Council, can Breidenbach and many others recover the world of conciliar Catholicism of the 18th century and the world that shaped John and Charles Carroll. Do I have that right? So it was a long-winded premise to a very short question. Do I have that right about where the sources of the reforms of the 1950s and 1960s come from? More provocatively, Breidenbach says Catholics demonstrated loyalty before being given liberty. They were loyal to the North American British colonies during the Revolutionary War, and that allowed them to receive liberty. And that the US constitutional regime requires this for not only Catholics, but everyone else, Mormons, Rastafarians. He sees this, Breidenbach, as a variation on a medieval problem never fully resolved in the modern period. And Breidenbach, as I said in my first couple sentences, is among those scholars, and I would count Eric Nelson, Brad Gregory, and others, trying to dissolve the lines between the medieval and the modern. Maybe, but this is my fourth and final question. Wasn't the First Amendment, with its ban on church establishments, something new? The problem of religion and state is old, but this solution, disestablishment, seems to me new. And weren't new understandings of conscience and human dignity in the 20th century, and I could add the trauma of the totalitarian crisis of the 1930s and the Second World War, even more important than conciliarism in getting us to the current moment? Breidenbach ends by stressing that, as I mentioned, the fragility of the line between modern and pre-modern. Fair enough. But sometimes problems are new and worlds are genuinely lost. Breidenbach's conciliarists can help us understand how we arrived at our current church-state dilemmas, but I don't think they can do much to solve them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, for this very insightful commentary. Thank you indeed. And I just leave the floor to Michael for his response and commentary. Let me just say, as a matter of few words of interval, that I was very interested in his book for many reasons. As John has said, we start with Calvert and we end with Carroll, which is exactly what I did personally. When my first book was on Calvert in Newfoundland, actually before Maryland, the first colony of Avalon, where I found all my priests who were with him, that I found recognized and acknowledged in his book. And then In fact, I almost stopped with the carols and the way they were elected, etc., etc. So, I mean, I found this book fascinating. I learned so much out of it for things that I personally had done it in a parallel way with him. But let me leave the floor to him. Michael, that's your way.
Well, thank you very
Michael,
much.
può parlare, vero?
Yes, here I am.
Go on.
Thank you very much again to you both. And let me just echo Luca's thanks to Kathleen Cummings for this invitation at the Cushwa Center. I just saw in my inbox that the American Catholic Historical Association has given a great honor to that center for Distinguished Service Award. So congratulations to her and all her team for that honor. And again, thank you to Luca for the invitation, for moderating. I'm deeply indebted, as you know, Luca, to your work, including that early work on Newfoundland, and for your scholarship and indeed your friendship. And thanks again to the Rome Global Gateway. I have very fond memories of being there for the conference a few years ago on the kind of the globalization of Catholicism historically. And I look forward to visiting you all again. And John, very, very grateful for your incisive remarks. And I look forward to discussing these questions in the remaining time that we have. And also look forward to your new book coming out next year on that global turn, and as you encourage me to think about as well. You did a really good job summarizing, probably better than I could, of my book. So let me just get into your questions as a kind of frame for our discussion. The first question is the kind of, as it were, the soft point in the transition between the first part and the second part of the manuscript and book. This is something that perhaps has a sort of a writing history to it. I began the inquiry at the University of Cambridge with Skinner and the historians of political thought there in mind, and really asking the fundamental question: how could someone like Charles Carroll of Carrollton, or indeed Carroll himself, sign this Declaration of Independence? That was sort of the beginning question as an early doctoral candidate. And I had this intuition after reading Skinner's Foundations of Modern Political Thought, Volume 2, that this has to have something to do with these kind of medieval debates. And I didn't know exactly how that trickled down into early modern discourses. And then, as you mentioned, Dale Van Clay's work was incredibly important in that early stage, especially to open my eyes to how that might work as the Carrolls were being educated in France. And so I then moved to the Calverts later. So I had a bit of a kind of walking backwards, as it were, in history. And when I was on fellowship at Oxford, I had the opportunity to go to London to these Westminster Diocese archives and find more material on the Calverts, especially on the question of the Oath of Allegiance, which animates a lot of that first section. And so you're right. What is the link between these two Catholic dynasties in Maryland? What is the link between the 16th, 17th century mainly and the 18th century? And I think the answer to that is that it is indeed something of a kind of detour in some ways. And I think that's the contingent fact of the historical development of Maryland history, especially. So as you know, the Maryland government changes hands in the Revolution 1688. And so what we find is a kind of disjunction between the early Maryland design, as they would say, and the first and second Lords Baltimore, and then Charles Carroll, the settler. So Charles Carroll of Carrollton's grandfather, who comes to Maryland in 1688 in the fall. And so there is a bit of a, you might call it sort of, as it were, detour or kind of interlude between these two periods. And what I try to do is make a conceptual link to show the way in which the Carroll family sees the Calverts as a kind of legacy, a legal and political legacy that they bestow, that's undermined by that, as they call it, a Protestant takeover. And they sort of resurrect that legacy, that legal culture, right? The strategy of dealing with oaths of allegiance and religious toleration. Of course, the Maryland Toleration Act of 1649. All these documents, the Maryland Charter, become, as it were, fresh in the minds of the Carrolls again, and try to, in their own struggle for religious liberty personally and as a church collectively, they try to, as it were, reintroduce that to Maryland politics with not a lot of success, it must be said, for the first two generations of the Carrolls. But by the time we get to the 1760s and 1770s, the religious and political landscape is quickly shifting. So I think you're right to say that there is that hinge point is sort of not as neat and tidy as it should be, and that probably is partly my fault in terms of finding that link, right? But also, one of the contingencies of Maryland history, especially. But it's a very good thing to point out. You encourage me to go global, and I think that's exactly what I would like to do in subsequent works, to show the way in which there's this kind of conciliarist moment in the 18th and continuing in the 19th century. And that would include exactly the sort of figures and texts that you referenced, John. I think that's absolutely important. And your work and many others have urged us to think globally in that way. And in other words, being Atlantic is not enough. And we're talking about a global church with connections between people, among people and ideas and trade routes and all the rest that demand that kind of attention. So just to take your cue on Henri Grégoire, for instance, he's a very important figure, obviously, for the Gallican Church, especially prescient in the French Revolution as a constitutional clergyman and later bishop, who corresponds with Bishop John Carroll in letters that have been preserved. One, I think, is missing, and that will be a task for an historian to find whether we can, find that one or two letters between these two men. And I think their correspondence that's extant to us is very interesting, because Grégoire is inviting John Carroll to see the American Revolution as completely consistent, at least in the early stages of the French Revolution, with that revolution, his revolution. And John Carroll's a little bit, careful to agree with the constitutional bishop on that question. He's a bit uncomfortable, for instance, with the way in which the French Revolution is turning more, let's call it secularist. The way in which the French state, by the time of the National Assembly, is subsuming the Gallican Church within a kind of state apparatus. And this is very different from the American arrangement that John Carroll is such a champion of. This, as you mentioned, this disestablishment, at least at the federal level and in Maryland. And so there are important discontinuities, I think, between Grégoire and de Carroll. And that needs to be teased out. In other words, this conciliarist moment does not dictate the exact political arrangement on the ground. It is fundamentally an ecclesiastical theory, right, about constitutional sort of church organization. And it does have political consequences, to be sure, but those are going to be refracted within the particular arrangements of that country. So a Gallicanism in France, the kind of conciliarist manifestation in France, is actually quite different as it is in England. And so that sort of history that still needs to be written would have to be attentive to the local inflections that I try to be attentive to in the sort of Protestant Empire context of the United States, of Maryland, and eventually the United States. So that's what it would look like to go wide in that case. And I think you're very attentive to the fact that I start in 1606 or even before with Pope Alexander VI, papal bull Inter Carita, and then end with sort of the recent Supreme Court decision on Fulton versus City of Philadelphia, the last footnote. I must say most of the 19th and 20th century ruminations that I have are couched in the conclusion. This is effectively 200 years of history. And so I would say that more needs to be written. Maybe it's Our Dear About Liberty, Volume 2, in which we take the 19th and 20th century in much more detailed approach that shows the conciliarist meanderings, even during the so-called ultramontane century of the 19th, right? I think that needs to be, worked out with more detail than a conclusion can do justice for. But that's what it looked like, I think, to go wide, and I think you're exactly right to push the historiography in that direction. Is there something exceptional to American conciliarist arrangements? I think there is, in the sense that if you judge it based on the Ancien Regime in France and the English constitutional and religious arrangements in the 17th and 18th centuries, to be sure, the disestablishment of the church in most states by the time we get to 1800, and certainly at the federal level, is exceptional. The one caution, of course, to say is that it's not necessarily implied that the First Amendment, as it were, settles that ancient or medieval question about church-state relations. So I think there is something about the way in which the First Amendment is new, and this sort of recognition of religious conscience is something of a new development. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's absolutely unique. I think the recent book, Liberty and Things of God, by Professor Wilkin, I think shows the way in which Christians have been thinking about conscience rights for quite some time. But certainly the American founding and the constitutional arrangement there opens the political possibility for that to be instantiated in a fairly secular, at least juridically secular, federal constitutional structure. Having said that, I don't think the First Amendment, as it were, ultimately solves that fundamental theological or political problem about, the proper relationship between political and ecclesiastical authorities. In some ways, it's a jurisdictional intervention, and effectively says, let's devolve power to the states to let it decide. And as you know, New Hampshire and Massachusetts continue, and a few others continue their establishments in the state for a few more decades. The question about slavery is an important one, because you're right to say that on balance, those with a sort of conciliarist sensibility are a bit more disposed to, if not an abolitionist commitment, at least a kind of gradual abolition of slavery. And I think Gregoire is a good example of this. And so there may be a case to be made about the way in which the Carrolls are against that grain. And I think there are, again, particular contingent reasons for that. I'm not sure if it rises to the level of conceptual consistency here. Charles Carroll of Carrollton inherited the slaves from his father. That doesn't exonerate him whatsoever. He continued to buy and sell people. And so John Carroll likewise had what he called a servant, but effectively was a slave. And as recent history has shown, his founding of Georgetown University was intrinsically linked with this institution. And so I think the particular, as it were, Southern history involved in the Carrolls has to be a good part of that story of why they saw their conciliarist commitments and Republican commitments, as it were, consistent with their slaveholding. And here I rely on Maura Jane Forelli's analysis in several academic journals, but also in her book, Papist Patriots, who effectively argues that this kind of slaveholding was the way in which they could declare themselves reliable members of a white elite society. And as I note in the book, slaves cannot own slaves. And this is one of the ways in which they could rhetorically show that the kind of mental slavery that they were charged with by being Catholic could be responded to, right? We're not slaves. We have the slaves, and be part of that kind of white elite society. And so in some ways, this is a particular kind of Southern American story that helps to explain, but not exonerate, their particular slaveholding. But here again, John Carroll, when confronted by French Catholics on the question of slavery, has very little to say, actually, by way of endorsing a kind of gradual abolition. Gregoire is quite insistent that Catholics should not be owning slaves, and that we should change this institution. And John Carroll finds it, as it were, too politically sensitive. And this is the strategy among Southern bishops throughout the 19th century as well. It's a very awkward balance that they try to strike between not intervening in these admittedly very tense political discourses, while also trying to make provisions on the side for the baptism of slaves and the catechesis of slaves and so on. It's a very complex picture, but I think that global history would shed more light on it. You asked how historians of early America have received my claim of a conciliarist influence. I think, you mentioned Eric Nelson at Harvard. He was a member of a manuscript workshop that I did at Harvard University, and he was very receptive to that claim. He wanted me to, during the manuscript stage, sort of temper the claim slightly, which is to say, this is definitely not how. This may be how Catholics became American, but it's not how America became Catholic. And so there's no sense in which, to reference the 19th century Catholic historiography, there's no sense in which Robert Bellarmine his ghost looms large in the constitutional drafting, as some during Bellarmine's beatification canonization, must be said, tried to argue. And so I'm not making that strong claim, and I think it would frankly be absurd to think that James Madison somehow had in mind John of Paris. But I think there is a connection between John of Paris and James Madison, and the throughput is someone like Daniel Carroll, who's friends with Madison, and sees the way in which Catholics have no reason not to be, right? It's sort of a negative, right? They've, as it were, crossed the threshold of citizenship, right? They've met John Locke's test for loyalty. And it is interesting, as you open, John, with those really arresting classroom sort of images of a student asking a professor this question. It is very interesting that John Locke thought that any Catholic who denied papal infallibility or papal authority in temporal affairs of countries, he said that those would be a false and fallacious kind of Catholic, a kind of argument. And so what's remarkable about the American founding is that someone like John Adams, James Madison, and so on, took them seriously. They took those arguments seriously, and they trusted them. And I think certainly other advantages like their loyal service to the constitutional framing, their fighting the Revolutionary War, many Catholics did, certainly helped with that, as France's alliance did as well. Let me end with the contemporary moment. I went back and forth. I was talking with Austin Inverray at lunch in Oxford a few years ago, and I said, I'm writing the conclusion, and I really want to say something about Pope Francis, and the way in which the Holy Father is inviting more collegiality and conciliar thought. And I was talking with Ken Parker likewise about this. And I said, Ken Parker especially sort of counseled, well, you can talk about that after the book is published, and certainly people will pick up on the contemporary resonances. So I think you're right to say that I'm oblique, right? I don't want to say too much about the contemporary moment in a work of history, but I do want to gesture to it, because I think as you noted, I think these are sort of, as it were, enduring tensions between these two spheres and authorities. And so what we find with John Courtney Murray in his academic work at the Theological Studies Journal is explicit references to conciliarist texts. And he effectively says that these medieval jurists solved our modern problem. And he can be excused for the anachronism. I think that was his sort of like political, theological, argument that we need this kind of argumentation to make sense of Catholicism in the United States. And we hold these truths. He effectively turns not to John of Paris, but to the First Amendment and other more contemporary sources, as does John F. Kennedy, right? He references the bishops, contemporary bishops, on the question of church and state. And so that's, I think, a kind of public rhetorical move. It would make no sense for public intellectuals and presidents to quote John of Paris, as I do. But the continuity intellectual history is quite clear to me. And so I think there is a shift now with the scholarship to plumb the depths of these intellectual resources and show the way in which, John F. Kennedy's strategy, although unbeknownst to him perhaps, was quite consistent with the way in which early American Catholics understood their dual identities. So thank you again for those really perceptive questions. I look forward to questions from the audience.
Michael, thank you very much. We are almost at the end, as a matter of fact, of the hours we had allotted to this discussion, this conversation. I didn't stop you because the whole thing was very interesting, and in fact, in responding to John Mcgreevey's questions, I mean, you added so much to your book and to your thought. Now we do have 5 minutes, so do we have? You're now unmuted. You can mute yourself, but do you have a quick questions for either of the speakers, or Mike or John? Any of you? You can raise your hand, or I have one, if I may use my 2 minutes. Conciliarism is something that you make very clear what it was. You make it very clear as a political historian, political scientist in a way, as if people were involved in making things, in being Catholic on the spot, had this kind of a theoretical mind about what to use theoretical instruments to pursue their own ways and their own objectives. When I deal with trustees, which are the quintessential examples of conciliarism, I have difficulty in putting together the theory with the practice. The practice is power within the parish, wherever the parish was. Conflict between the Irish and the French, the Irish and Bishop Marischal or Bishop Carroll, power struggles. And then you have very few political thinkers. You mentioned one, you mentioned João Fernandes, which I believe was active in Virginia somewhere, or Charleston, I don't remember now. But it's one of the very few political theorists who actually speaks about the theory of conciliarism at that time. And he remains in the United States, if I remember, for less than 1 year. So he goes, he tried to put on his ideas, and then he goes away because there is no real way, really any way to put in practice his theories. So the cleavage, the difference between theory and practice, is what strikes me as a major theme at this time. Was that a question that you can answer?
Yes. No, that's always fair to ask an intellectual historian, right? The ways in which ideas, as it were, and here we reify ideas, anytime we put a verb on it, right? Drive history, motivate people, and so on, affect events. And I think that's incredibly fair to ask me this question in this particular context, because we're talking about not just ideas, but religious beliefs, right? Beliefs about a church. And so that just sort of, as it were, raises the stakes. And one thing that I try to show, especially say in the first part about the Calverts, who are incredibly practical-minded people. They're trained as lawyers, and they're trying to find legal solutions to some of these problems. And likewise, Charles Care of Carrollton is trained as a lawyer in London, although incredibly humanistically educated, must be said, by the Jesuits. And so one of the tests that I ask myself is, if this is just about practicalities, a kind of pragmatism, right? Wouldn't it be, as it were, much easier to join the Anglican Church, especially for the Lord's Baltimore, right? In some ways, for George Calvert, he reverts to his childhood Catholic faith. Cecil Calvert did not have to convert necessarily, or he could have converted for his father, and then when his father died, he could have reverted, as later Lords Baltimore did. And so if this is just a matter of sort of practicality or kind of power politics, right, then it would be much easier for them to convert. And furthermore, it would be much easier, as it were, to even if you didn't want to convert, not really care about this oath of allegiance, right, in any substantive sense. You would simply just say, well, this is a kind of theological opinion, and not care, as you didn't care before, about an inter carita, and not think that you'd actually be excommunicated, and sail to Maryland, and that would be fine. In other words, I think at some level of analysis, the practicalities break down, and you have to really think about the kind of ideas that make your life consistent, like a kind of holistic sense of self, right? How these identities work together. I think that's an animating question for these characters, and that's where ideas, as it were, come in. So when it comes down to just using a kind of law office history or law office theory, right, just cribbing whatever kind of ideas or historical analogies or cases work for your end, I don't think that's exactly what they're doing. I think they, especially in the case of the Carrolls, especially John Carroll, really believe that papal infallibility is a mere theological opinion. And he says that both publicly and privately. It doesn't matter what the context is. And it doesn't matter if he's talking with a parishioner who wants to know whether he can be a Freemason or not. And, John Carroll says, well, the papal bull does not really have much authority here. It hasn't been received by the national bishops. And to which I said to Bishop Carroll, you are the national bishop. You are the one who can decide this. He in every case, he is sort of saying the same thing, which gives a sense to me that he actually believes it. It's one thing to sort of say things to other people just to appease them. It's another thing to be consistent about it. So I think it's a happy coincidence, perhaps a little bit more than that, but it's certainly not pure power politics or practicalities driving their beliefs. I think there's an interplay between them.
Thank you very much. John, last word to you. You have 1 minute to say the last word.
Michael answered better than I could. The only thing I'd add is with those trustees, they are always referring to their admiration of the early Christian church. And that's a kind of key phrase for all these Reformed Catholics. Let's get beyond the medieval period and go to the early Christian church. And whether or not they're reading John of Paris is maybe less relevant than they have a sense of an alternative Catholic vision. And I think that's absolutely true. And it's true on the ground too. And I think Michael's book demonstrates it.
Thank you very much to you all for being here, for having listened to our speakers, and of course, for our speakers to be here today and have presented their opinion. Michael, thank you very much for you
Thank you.
being here, for your book, and John for your commentary. And I hope to see you all very soon in person. And thank you very much for
Thank you.
all of you who attended this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Goodbye.